Welcome everybody to Queer Cafes Past and Present. My name is Bren Frederick. I'm the director and founder at BiPAN Library. And I'm really honored to be facilitating today's event in collaboration with QT Library. We have our two very patient panelists here, but first we are going to talk about the two libraries collaborating on this event. BiPAN Library is an independent research library, archive, and virtual community space serving the Bi, Pan, and m-spec community. Since 2020, BiPAN Library volunteers have worked to increase free access to queer history, created resources suited to the specific needs of queer people attracted to multiple genders, and hosted events like the one you're attending right now. As well as providing free one-on-one research assistance to students, educators, organizations, journalists, parents, and anyone else curious about m-spec history and culture. The library's work is entirely funded by community donations, and you can learn more about our work and how to support it at bipanlibrary.com, and follow us on social media at BiPAN Library on all platforms. And I'm going to hand off now to my friend Emily Talley from QT Library, who I've had the pleasure of organizing this event alongside.
Bren, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Emily Talley, and I have the privilege of being the executive director of the QT Library. The QT Library is an LGBTQ+ library opening to the public with a brick-and-mortar location in Boston, Massachusetts in June 2024. Our mission is to nurture the curiosity and magic of the queer and trans community through centralized resources and curated programs held in an affirming space. The QT Library is a free-for-all, all ages, and sober community space and lending library. To learn more about the QT Library, you can find us on the internet at qtlibrary.org and on Instagram at qt.library, or you can send us an email, hello@qtlibrary.org.
All right, it is time to introduce our special guests who have been waiting so patiently. Dr. Alex Ketchum is here with us. Alex is the author of Ingredients for Revolution, A History of American Feminist Restaurants, Cafes, and Coffeehouses. Everybody hold up their copies. And also an assistant professor at McGill University's Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. Her work integrates food, environmental, technological, queer, and gender history. And she's actively involved in feminist food and environmental politics. In 2009, she founded Farmhouse in Middleton, Connecticut, a living community dedicated to food politics works that continues today. Thank you for being here, Alex.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for that kind introduction.
We also have Jennifer Park with us today. Jennifer is the co-owner and co-founder of Diesel Cafe, which has served the Massachusetts queer community since 1999. While she spent the last 25 years in Massachusetts, she attributes a great deal of her love for food, service, and work philosophy to her Japanese roots. Currently, Jennifer focuses their time at work growing the business long-term, developing staff, thinking about food, and tasting food and drinks. Jennifer, we're so delighted to have you here today.
Thank you.
All right, to begin, I think we need to establish a few things about this concept we're discussing, which is, can food be queer or queered? What is a queer food space to each of you?
Jennifer, do you want to go first as the cafe owner?
Sure. I think certainly, it's an interesting approach. It's not something that I've really thought too much about. Also, just being in the industry and being with the food all the time. It's not something that I had thought of. Certainly, I attribute sort of my initial identity to my Japanese and Korean roots, which I think of having more influence on my culinary perspective than my queer identity. So it's been an interesting concept. I'd love to hear what you have to say, Alex, and sort of piggyback on any other concepts. I certainly think anything that is made by a queer chef or queer folk in the community can certainly be queer. There's a part of that person in the food. And I think that's something that all of our places, I also co-own Block Cafe and Forge Baking Company, also in Somerville. We employ up to 70 people, and it's so many of our people who work for us do identify as queer. So I definitely think that's a big part of how food can be identified, for sure.
I love how your definition talks about the people making the food. So for background, I'm trained as a historian, and definitions are always really difficult. And so in all my work, I always try to think about, how does the person who's doing this work think of their work as queer food or a queer food space, rather than me coming in and saying, like, this is the full definition of queer food as like a kind of prescriptive definition. But that being said, I think there are several components to what is queer food. Part of it is who's making the food, the identities of the people who are part of cooking the food, growing the food, distributing the food, marketing the food. I think the food itself can be queer in terms of certain community histories. For example, different foods in different parts of the queer community have certain resonances, like, oh, this is what we eat, as a way to like celebrate our identity. Also, the space surrounding the community. So in terms of like the restaurant or cafe space itself queers the food just by creating a space for queer community to meet, gather, celebrate, host events, readings, concerts, have queer art on the wall, queer music playing. And I think because of that, there's a multiplicity of queer food, but it's something I think about all the time. And I'm actually organizing a conference this April in Boston, April 27th and 28th, with Boston University's Food Studies program about what is queer food. So that conference actually invites folks to give their own definitions of queer food and how they see it across time and place. So I think it's a complicated question, but one that's exciting.
Your book dives really deep into the history of feminist coffee shops and cafes, many of which were lesbian run or otherwise staffed by queer people. What drew you personally to this topic?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different roots of the origin story of this project. So part of it was just my own background. When I was living in Middletown, Connecticut, going to Wesleyan University, I was really involved in like co-running and operating the school's organic farm. I had started that food politics living community on campus, Farmhouse, that you had mentioned in my introduction. And I was taking a lot of history and feminist studies courses. And I was thinking about the topic for my undergrad honors thesis. And a friend and I was going to write about kind of gender and food relationships in the US context. And a friend had mentioned, oh, have you ever heard of Bloodroot Feminist Vegetarian Restaurant and Bookstore in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is about 45 minutes away from Middletown. And so I went with some friends and visited. The space was opened in 1977 and still operates today by some of the original founders. And I was just super fascinated about the space. I started writing about it at that time when I was around 20, 21 years old. And I continued to think about these kind of feminist, specific, like self-designated feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses in the US and Canada as part of my master's and doctoral work. And the thing with these spaces is, even though they're oftentimes labeling themselves as feminist, as you had mentioned, they were primarily run by lesbians and women who today might define themselves as queer women. So yeah, this just brought together a lot of my own personal interests, my own experiences having worked in bakeries, on farms. And yeah, so that's kind of where the project came from. And I think in working on the project, it also helped me realize kind of the spaces that I was looking for as I was kind of discovering my own queer identity and the kinds of communities that I was looking for centered on food.
Jennifer, you've been out in the world doing this thing that Alex has been researching all these years, since 1999. Linked on your cafe's website is this beautiful blog called Diesel Love Stories, where people have written about like the impact of Diesel's communities had on their life. I read in one post a former employee lovingly describing the shop as more queer as in fuck you and less gay as in designer jeans. How did you and your co-founder Tucker Lewis first envision Diesel? What did those early days look like?
So Tucker and I met working at an ice cream shop in Harvard Square in 1995, my freshman year of college. And, we kind of had this idea and this dream of creating this place where anyone could come work or come into as a guest and feel comfortable and welcomed. Currently we were working at a place where you weren't allowed to have any piercings. Tattoos were still illegal in Massachusetts, and so you couldn't show any of your tattoos, according to this owner operator. And we just wanted to create a space where people could be their full selves and feel comfortable doing so. And that was really our founding mission. The emphasis on food and local food and quality food also came as we became more serious with our mission a number of years into our project and starting Block and opening Forge, which allowed us to have full creative ownership over our food, where we're getting our ingredients from, what kind of menu we're creating. All of that has been a great journey to ultimately create a space that is inclusive and welcoming for everyone to work and to come in as a guest. Our spaces are uniquely very large. They're about 5,000 square feet. I don't know how many other cafes support that kind of space, especially in this market. It's been challenging. But certainly that's kind of our intention, is to create a space where our seats are full, and we daily have hundreds of people who are coming into our space, sitting there, doing their work, connecting with friends, family. And I think that's sort of been our goal this whole time.
Wow. Yeah, I have a lot of questions about some of the challenges that there have been over the years.
Sure, yeah.
That I will let's just jump to that, actually, since you've brought it up. Diesel's been around since 1999, which it's such an impressive span of time. I feel like kind of for any restaurant to remain open or cafe,
Yeah.
but especially for a queer-run food space. I mean, there's been at least one recession and an ongoing pandemic during that time. Like there's
Oh, yeah.
I can understand how there'd been challenges. What have been some of those challenges, or maybe even like mistakes that you've learned from?
I think, every year, I think I learned something new as a business owner and operator. And I think that one of the only reasons that we've been able to be successful and still relevant is that we've been able to kind of shift with the changing of times, whether it's a recession, a global pandemic, the unionization of our company in the past 2 years. All of those have created waves and sort of turmoil, and our ability to kind of work with the ebbs and flows of those challenges and kind of turn them into something other than an adversarial relationship, I think, is the only way that we've kind of come out on the other side each time. The recession in 2007, 2009 was very difficult to come out from. That was when we had opened our second store. So that was a huge financial hurt. And certainly 2020, 2021, 2022 has been very challenging coming out of the pandemic.
Alex, in your book, I mean, there's a lot of discussion of the challenges that these various spaces faced, but I wanted to particularly point out that to folks who may not have read your book yet, there's this really cool section at the end of the book. I delighted all of us who are reading the book in prep for this event. You compiled a directory of feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses, defunct and still open. Could you share maybe a little bit about what compiling that was like, and also maybe one or two of the cafes that stand out in your mind as particularly interesting?
For sure. Okay, so that's kind of a big question, because making this list was probably the biggest part, and I still update it. I invite people to share any names of any spaces that they see aren't on the list, and I add to it regularly. So yeah, basically the first one I knew about was Bloodroot, and the next one I knew about was Bread and Roses, which had existed in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So that Massachusetts connection there. But I wanted to, when I first started this project, people were saying, well, was this even really that much of a phenomenon? Was this just like one or two places? Like, how important could this have been? And so I found it was really important to kind of establish how prevalent these spaces were and now continue to be in kind of a new resurgence of places that are labeling themselves as feminist, but are really upholding a lot of different kind of like lesbian and now a lot of queer ideals. And so I did it through a variety of methods. I went through thousands of periodicals through the article section, the advertisement sections. I went through ephemera collections at queer archives and women's movement archives, which the ephemera collections have things like random business cards, flyers, concert posters, buttons. And sometimes that's what I'd find out about a space. I looked through women's travel guides, which were basically code for lesbian and queer women's travel guides, and used that to kind of build out these directories. I started to put the materials around 2013 onto my website, thefeministrestaurantproject.com, and I invited people to email me if they saw any places. I also had a map at one point where people could add things, but no one was really interested in doing that. They just wanted to email me. So I took that map down, but there's another map that still exists. Yeah, I did oral histories. I went on Facebook pages of different groups of older lesbian women and asked them about where they had gone. Some cafe owners recommended other spaces. I visited, I think it was 19 archives also for this project. So it was really big, and I don't think it'll ever be finished. And then of course, kind of for the more recent places, it's a bit easier to find like the places that have opened since 2015 and such, because there's usually some kind of web presence. But even still, like terminology is hard. So this book and the directory isn't comprehensive of every lesbian or queer cafe. They had to somehow call themselves feminist in their title, their marketing, or in interviews or other kinds of materials like that. So there are some lesbian queer spaces that like won't show up in the book, because I was really interested in the stakes of what they meant by defining themselves as feminist. That kind of first drove me to the project. And then over time, I really realized how much it was a project about lesbian and queer women's spaces. So yeah, it was a variety of ways. But something I was looking at today also and writing about is, so I mentioned event flyers, but actually I've looked at the archives of musicians who are part of the women's music movement, which was basically a lesbian music movement, and their own archival phone, like their collections, their records have flyers that say the names of a bunch of different cafes and restaurants they played at as well. So that's like another way to find some of them. So mixed methods, I guess.
And makes sense. I mean, in the 70s, we didn't have like BuzzFeed listicles of like top 9 queer-owned restaurants. And I felt I learned a lot from your book, Alex, about the many different ways the owners thought about themselves, about their politics. Anything could become like a community discourse. Different spaces that knew about each other had different views on different things. So many things about these spaces became political because of the people who were running them. And the specific section that I'm thinking about was talking about how even like what was put on the menu was such a discussion for many of these spaces. Some of them avoided diet plates and diet sodas because they were trying to avoid like patriarchal shame about women's bodies. Bloodroot had a sign above the counter that said, "Because all women are victims of fat oppression, and out of respect for women of size, we would appreciate you refraining from agonizing aloud over the calorie count in our food." I thought it was so interesting how it isn't just about it being a place that you go and you eat. Sometimes it's about the conversations and the work that is done in these spaces, and not just the people who are running them, but the people who are coming and working in those spaces. Jennifer, when you were talking earlier about like providing a space where people can come and they can work, they can gather, they can converse. I'm interested, Alex, if you could share any of the other community discussions that arose in the just through the running of these spaces.
Oh yeah, that's a big question. I think I keep saying that to all of them, but I mean, that's what happens when you spend like more than 12 years on a project. Yeah, so I mean, there was a lot of debate about ways to finance the spaces. There were efforts to do what we might call like crowdfunding today. People used a lot of their own money to start the spaces, and many of them didn't have a lot of money. Bank financing wasn't really an option for most of the people who started the spaces in the early 1970s, especially because it was prior to the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974. So women couldn't get credit in their own name. It had to be in their husband's or father's. So for like lesbians, that was probably not going to be an option. I mean, some lesbians in the movement at the time were married to men, but in general, they weren't going to get financing from banks usually. So they had to be creative in financing, and this could create a lot of discussions about how money should be allocated. Huge amount of discussions around the pricing of the food in order to make sure that the people working in them were properly compensated, the farmers were properly compensated, they could get good ingredients, and also that the people coming to the space could afford the dishes. But like I have this diagram of a triangle, that's really hard to balance. And what often happened was the people starting the spaces wouldn't pay themselves properly, which led to burnout, exhaustion, underpay, and wasn't sustainable. And that led to the end of many of them. And especially kind of within the first generation of the spaces. As you had mentioned, there was a lot of discussion about what type of food should be served. So Bloodroot has been vegetarian since its beginning. I mean, it included a few fish dishes in the very, very beginning, but then that over time has become more vegan and has really tried to have seasonal dishes. Many of the spaces were vegetarian, but not exclusively so. And to speak to what Jennifer was talking about, there's an emphasis in some of the spaces about how like wanting a place where people could live as workers, being out of the closet, living as out lesbians, out feminists, being able to be in a space that reflected their values, where they could feel safe at work, dress as they wanted to. For the founder of the Wild Rose in Seattle, she talked about how she wanted there to be windows, so it wouldn't be a hidden space, but where people could bring their families and eat food, that it would be open on holidays so people would have a place to go and feel comfortable. There's a lot of discussion, debate about what type of art should be on the wall, who should be a political speaker in this space, what kind of music should be played. And every space kind of enacted this differently, but a huge part of it was that they were always thinking about how could they foreground their feminism. And for the ones, especially in the 70s and like early 80s, their lesbian identity. And then later, as spaces have kind of developed over time, discussions of queer identity, trans identity, and a lot of kind of trying to push back on ableism and racism, and some of the transphobia that had existed in some of the previous spaces.
Jennifer, does any of that focus that there has to be on all of these details in politics resonate with you?
I think the financial challenge that Dr. Ketchum brought up in terms of trying to meet the needs of compensating yourself, your employees, your vendors, and meeting the market and keeping your food affordable. Again, I think that that's the biggest challenge that we face right now, as our rents climb, as our wages increase, the cost of ingredients and everything, as we all know, continues to rise. And so that's a constant challenge of like, what is the tipping point of what's the most important? Like paying your workers to do the work is a crucial component of staying viable and making sure that you can, to us, that's an incredibly important part. And so that is a big part of why, we voluntarily recognized the union efforts and also negotiated and reached our first contract in less than a year, unlike Starbucks, who I think is still yet to reach their first contract. So all of those challenges are incredibly relevant, even going back to, I know, Alex, you were referencing kind of the 70s, but I think even in the early mid 90s, when we were looking for financing, part of it, we were very young and had no experience. There were a lot of factors that played into it, but we could not find financing anywhere. And I think the only way that we funded our project was to take out massive credit card loans, because it was kind of before they started restricting credit, and we could just take out credit card after credit card. So we had about $100,000 that we opened Diesel on credit cards. So yeah, it was one of those stupid young things that you do, and it kind of turned out okay.
That sounds really stressful, but I'm so glad that it worked out. That was super fascinating. And there's a lot in the book about like the various ways people found funding or eventually ran out of funding. unfortunately.
Mhm.
Which, while we're thinking about money, one of the reasons that finances are so difficult in some cases was just because conflicts arise between queer spaces and capitalist systems. Do either of you have any thoughts about why that is or what that looks like?
Yeah. I think I mean, especially if we're thinking about queer, and there's like a question in the Q&A also speaking to this about like how we're defining queer, but we're thinking about kind of queer and kind of the 1990s, like queer nation as queer as like political solidarity and movement, as rather than just an umbrella term. That's linking like the oppression of queer peoples and system and homophobia and transphobia as like part of these larger systems of oppression, and the role capitalism has to play in that. So there's always going to be this tension. And, you know, I've had people before say, well, how can you even call some of these spaces businesses when the people starting them said that it wasn't about making a profit? What they meant was it wasn't about like making a profit to like exploit people. They wanted to be able to ideally run and operate a business where everyone could be paid fairly and people could live their lives, and operate a space that reflected their values. But that is kind of different than certain capitalist models of like what it means to be a business. And there's always this tension of trying to provide a space that is part about giving care, that's part a community center. You know, some of the spaces also operate as bookstores, but also had free libraries and had sliding scale prices on certain dishes, and did a lot of unpaid community work, provided space for a lot of different community organizations without cost, you know? And so those things are in tension with capitalism and continue to be so. Queer anarchist, feminist, vegan anarchist chocolate maker Augusta Yearwood talks about this a lot, and the tension that she finds. And like also in listening to you, Jennifer, talking about these same kind of tensions of like, how do you balance the prices? How do you make sure that like everyone is supported and customers can still come to the space? I mean, this is a huge challenge.
So interesting that you bring up that they're often mixed spaces. The first queer food space that I ever frequented was a cafe that was attached to a queer library up in Seattle. They used to be called Gay City. It's now called Seattle's LGBTQ plus center, I believe. And it was wonderful. You could get your book, you could bring it into the cafe, you could have a nice little treat. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jennifer?
In terms of the conflicts between capitalism and queer spaces?
Yeah, or like what your definition of success also, like within a capitalist system, we're really pressured to see success as a very specific thing. How do you define success for yourself and Diesel?
Sure. Yeah, I think something that's important is, you know, like to Alex's point, that we as the owners feel like our work is sustainable. It is demanding in terms of we operate and our employees are in our spaces about 20 hours out of the day. So there's, you know, about 4 hours where something, you know, isn't going wrong. So it is kind of this constant sort of pull and sort of stress that can seep into kind of everyday life. But certainly ensuring that our employees are getting paid good wages, creating a space that is again, comfortable. I think another huge part of what we do is I'm an executive board member of an organization called Community Cooks, which is we mobilize local cooks. We have over 800 cooks who cook in their own homes, and we serve partner agencies in the local community, and we deliver food to them so that they can focus more on the actual services that they're providing to folks who are food insecure or food vulnerable. And having that ability as a business to ensure that we have a cooking team that serves these circles. We donate funds to the organization, and we're able to make charitable donations to other local organizations that we choose, whether it's school or other queer agencies. That's a big part of, I think, what having having success means to us, is like having that extra to then be able to give back to the community. And again, that's something that is, that is contingent upon the capitalist model, but it does allow us to contribute in that way.
That's really fantastic. That program sounds really, really cool.
It's incredible. Yeah.
Is there anywhere that people can learn more about that program?
Sure, I can definitely put something in the link as well. We are always looking for volunteers to be cooks or to lead cooking teams or to deliver. So it's always a great way to get involved.
Just a second ago, Alex referenced the sheer variety of needs that exist within the queer community. We present ourselves in many different ways. We all experience different forms of marginalization or privilege due to our gender, our race, our disability, our religion, our tax bracket in queer spaces in the past or now. How do you approach this wide range of needs, and what is the responsibility there?
I mean, I can speak to a very relevant challenge that we face.
Yeah.
Something that's important to us in creating our workspaces is inclusivity and diversity. And even though it is, I think, we're really well known for being a very queer accepting space. And so I think the assumption is that if you choose to work there, if you're employed there, that you know the right language, terminology, how to use the right pronouns and not mispronoun someone, misgender someone. But sometimes that's not the case. And as our hiring practices have kind of widened, typically we used to only hire from paper applications that people would drop off to us. So typically that was our customer base who really was rooted in our community, and knew what we were about. As we've widened our hiring pool and increased kind of the sphere that we're hiring from, we have people who commute 30, 45 minutes away and come into the city to come work for us. There's a lot more difference, and sometimes that difference can create some friction and tension. And so how to just create dialogue that isn't tense or disrespectful, and trying to make sure that those conversations can happen, while they're also still working, is really a challenge.
I think to speak kind of historically, overall, looking at about 230 plus spaces over time, in many different spaces, grappled with many questions about how to make their spaces accessible, what the name of the space even did in terms of who it welcomed and who felt excluded by the space, whether or not there was a ramp, whether it was wheelchair accessible, whether there are discussions about how music could make people feel included or excluded. Lots of discussions around race and racism within lesbian feminist communities. Lots of discussions about what was meant by the word woman in women's spaces. Was it trans inclusive, trans exclusive? Many of the same kinds of discussions that we have today. I think one of the kinds of differences is a lot of the places founded in the 70s and 80s had pretty small staffs working there. They were either co-run kind of collectives or had a couple of owners and then had a smaller staff. So it usually came from folks who knew the community, but even still, there were debates about who the space was for, and different workers feeling like it reflected their values or not reflected their values. And we see these kinds of discussions continue in a lot of the spaces today, and changes in terms of terminology and continued debates. But I would say most of the spaces, while imperfect in their application, there was a desire from many of them to learn and grow. And so there is responsiveness, such as in Minneapolis, one of the women's coffee houses there. I talk about this in the book. They decided they really needed to address racism within the space, and then committed a large percentage of their programming to having events centered on the experiences of Black women, paying Black women performers, Black women musicians. They decided to create anti-racist workshops, and like, so they committed to that practice. And it's not to say that it then became suddenly like a perfect space, but I think there was a constant ongoing reflection. And I think that's one of the things when we're thinking about queer spaces, especially ones that are kind of involving other social justice principles, feminism or other social justice principles, there is both a pressure from inside and outside to continue to be self-reflective and try to increase inclusion and diversity.
There's sort of a really cool contrast between the experiences you're each talking about, Alex talking about history, Jennifer talking about today. In the past, a lot of these spaces were constructed very specifically to address like feminists and queer people and lesbians, and there wasn't necessarily the interest in like serving the general public. And then Jennifer, today you have the opportunity to serve the broader community, perhaps not be as specific to just serving the queer community. I think that's very interesting, like the difference that there is in how we can move in the world in the 70s versus today.
I mean, even the difference between what it felt like to be queer in the 90s versus now is night and day.
Yeah. I would imagine you had to approach that very different in the 90s.
Yes, I think certainly. I mean, the way that I looked when I was 19 versus what I look like now is very different. I had a shaved head. I had, visible tattoos everywhere, and wore like cargo shorts and tank tops and like very sharp metal jewelry. And so it was pretty obvious. And my business partner also, was self-identified as like a butch dyke. And so I think, it was pretty obvious. And I think that some of the challenges that we faced in terms of finding a space and, securing funding, getting people to take us seriously, could have been either our lack of experience, our age, or certainly our, the fact that we presented as, very queer. I think that it feels very different now than it did for me, that many years ago.
We've talked a lot about the past. What does the future of queer food look like? Or what would you like it to look like? What change do you think can be made through these spaces?
Alex, I'm super curious. I'm going to pick up your book and read it. I'm really excited to do so. But I do think that really looking back to the history of these and recalling kind of, just hearing some of these anecdotes of, of a sign or just like a message, and kind of looking to how we should continue to do that messaging, because that's not gone. And just sort of continuing to remember that, even in my lifespan, to feel like there's been so much change, positive change, but there's still a lot more work to do ahead of that. And that, I think we want to make sure that, doing something like this, participating in a talk like this, really helps us to remember that there are other challenges that we need to continue to address, and that, as challenging as everything is in the world, like these are still goals that we should be shooting for. So I think that's a really important component of like really continuing to look to our history, our own histories, but even further back to kind of think about, what does that future trajectory look like for queer food spaces. And it's not something that I hear too often discussed, at least within our queer community, is like, what was the history like? And hearing in this conversation, as much as I have about the history of queer food spaces, is really interesting. And to know that we have in our own way been a part of that. So
I think building off of that, I think at least for queer food spaces, I think the future looks to that these will remain important. While terminology might change and definitions for self-identity might shift, there's going to be an ongoing need for places where people feel safe and supported, where they can work in their full sense of self and identity, where community can gather. And food is a really good vehicle for doing that. It gives people a reason to linger, to share over some kind of substance. And yeah, so I think queer food spaces will be really important. I think this question of like what the food itself will look like is a bit harder to project, and in some ways kind of talks about like our kind of larger ecological systems and what's going to happen with farming and like what kinds of resources are available. But about the spaces themselves, I really think that there will continue to be a need for them, even if the names of the spaces change and they're not using the word queer anymore, or and I think kind of social justice underlying cafes and restaurants will continue.
I'm not the expert in the room, but I gotta agree that I think it will continue being really important. We're going to transition to the Q&A now. I'll invite Emily back on screen. So Emily, would you like to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. So Dr. Ketchum, where would you recommend that we buy your book?
Awesome. So if you're in the Boston area, All She Wrote Books should have copies. So to support a local queer feminist bookstore. I did talk there last spring. So hopefully they still have some signed copies or some other copies. If you're not in the Boston area, please support your local bookstore. A lot of them can order it for you, or all the kind of places online. Also, you don't have to pay for a copy. I mean, it's nice that they're hard copies and they've become cheaper as it got reprinted. But it's also available open access. So I make all of my work available in some way for free, so you can read the book online. So it's a resource for people to learn about queer history.
Jennifer, how can people like support or learn more about Diesel, especially if they're not in the area? There's a lot of folks here who aren't from your area, but would really be interested in learning more.
Yeah, I think if there's, I'm happy to keep any conversation going. If you email through our website, info@diesel-cafe.com, I receive all of those emails from all three of our stores. So I'm happy to kind of keep any dialogue going if there's something more specific that we're not touching upon today. I think if you have friends who live in the area, spreading word of mouth and letting people know about us is always great. So yeah, thank you for asking that.
So this is an interesting question for Dr. Ketchum. It seems like your research revealed a link between queerness and vegetarianism or other meatless diets. Is this something unique to your research? I've heard this stereotype a lot, but never seen the research to back it up.
Yeah, it's not unique to my research. So I did find that in a lot of the spaces, as well as I have a project on queer cookbooks, and especially in the ones for lesbians and queer women, they tend to be more vegetarian. So you can see the virtual version of the exhibit at the historicalcookingproject.com. Or probably if you just Google queer cookbook exhibit, it'll pop up. So I've done research on cookbooks and also in restaurants seeing that. But there is discussions of vegetarianism and counterculturalism in the US context as part of different countercultural movements. Gennaro's book, I can also type in the name, but also the book Hippie Food also speaks to this. But it has been kind of part of a lot of different countercultural movements, including queer movements, but especially for lesbians and queer women. There was also a lot of links between feminist environmental movements, especially kind of eco-feminist movements, and lesbian culture as well. So yeah.
Okay, this next question could be for either of you. Melinda asks, pre-COVID, when we were starting a BI+ support group, a local queer-friendly coffee shop offered free meeting space. They also sponsored game nights, poetry slams, etc. How have you seen this type of community engagement in queer coffee shops in general?
I mean, I can speak to that from our perspective, since we do have larger spaces, and each of our cafes have sort of spaces that can table or kind of offer a gathering space for larger groups. That's definitely something that we've been open to. We used to have, I don't know what happened to this group, but every Tuesday and Thursday night, there used to be a large gathering of, they were the polyamorous group in Boston. They used to come to Diesel every week. And since COVID, we have not seen them come back. So I'm so curious where I hope that they're meeting somewhere in person. but yeah, that's definitely something that, again, you can email us through our websites. And if you're looking to kind of host a space, we just have some requests, but we can definitely offer a meeting space.
That is very cool. I love that.
Yeah,
And
everyone who's here for QT Library, get on that.
yeah, we're paying attention. We're taking notes, no question.
You're local.
Team, if you're not taking notes, no. Jennifer, another quick question from the chat. How do artists get their artwork on the walls at Diesel?
Great. Again, if you email us through the website, we have someone, again, like I said, I see all of the emails. So if you reference that you heard about us through this webinar, I can definitely flag it for our curator. I think something that's a little challenging is just that our spaces are so large, so that we do look for artists who can either have a group where they can sort of fill the walls, or have enough work to fill the walls. But yeah, we have a little bit of a waiting list right now, but we are always looking for queer artists, people of color, as much diversity on the walls as we can.
Okay, this question is for Alex. In your research, did you find any info on queer spaces accepting or discluding bisexual, pansexual folks or women? And did you find anything on bi erasure?
Yes, unfortunately, in terms of the exclusion. So, so it kind of changes over time and in each space and in each like kind of geographic context as well. So some of the spaces kind of began under ideas of political lesbianism, which isn't really something we talk about today, but it was this idea that you could choose to be a lesbian as the embodiment of your feminist values. And so there's this line that feminism is the theory and lesbianism is the practice. Now, this isn't really how we think about like sexual orientation and identity and desire today, but it was something that some people were experimenting with, considering. And so kind of under that kind of discourse and under kind of lesbian separatist discourse, there was mistreatment of bi folks. There is a lot of kind of apprehension, but many of the folks who even identified as lesbian separatists had relationships with men at some point in their lives. And so there's a lot of kind of discussion around that. I find that like over time, communities became more accepting of bi women and bi women's experiences, but this was always an ongoing conversation. Some of the places that I looked at were open to everyone who wanted to come. They just had to be respectful of the space. And so that way, bisexual women, for example, could bring like male partners into the space. But for places that were women only and exclusive, then there was that same kind of tension. But it really kind of changed over time. I find, I didn't talk about this, but the final chapter of the book talks about space. So basically, a lot of the book focuses from 1972 to 1989, but then the kind of final chapter looks at like more spaces in the past kind of 20 to 30 years. And so we see this kind of resurgence of places that are calling themselves explicitly feminist and really embodying a lot of queer values around 2015, 2016, in response to the rise of Trumpism. And these spaces are run by, most of them are run by women of color. They're trans inclusive. They're really queer inclusive, like folks across like the LGBTQ plus spectrum. And so there's not that same kind of bi erasure, but yeah, it's an ongoing challenge, I think, within queer communities at large.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't find any of that surprising, given my own research, but that's super interesting. Sorry, Emily, do you want to grab another question?
Yes, so this is not a question, but a comment for Jennifer. Karina says, I used to take the T from Boston University to Davis Square for Diesel back in like 2015. Have been grateful to be authentically me in your space for years. So thank you.
Aw, thank you so much. That makes my night.
That's so awesome. Okay, this question is for anybody. What queer spaces have been important in your lives?
I think starting in high school, my Gay Straight Alliance, which I was the president of. And then later in college, I think a really important group that I was a part of was I went to Harvard, and we had a Gay Straight Alliance, but we also had a women only group called Girl Spot. And that was run and for exclusively female identifying people. And I think those were a couple of really important spaces to me. And then, once we opened, again, I was 20, 21 when we opened Diesel. And so, that's kind of been a really important space. And I'm at work a lot. I'm either at home or at work. So
You're busy making the queer space.
mhm.
Yeah, I think for me also, like Jennifer, I love that you brought up the GSA. And I always joke about my own experiences in high school, where I was in the GSA originally as an ally. I think which is a common experience for a lot of like bi and pan people. But I always was like, why did we never talk about bisexual people? And by the end of high school, I came out, but I do think that was an important space, even though I thought I first joined it to support some of my friends. And then I think, there's the places that I've engaged with kind of like through my like research. I'm kind of a nerd, unsurprisingly. And so for me, spaces that have been really important have been bookstores and archives, where I've been able to kind of dig into this history and make a lot of friends who are thinking about these aspects historically. And also just the kind of like gathering spaces at bookstores in terms of events, readings, and so forth. So formal and informal spaces, queer run cafes where I can hang out with friends and drink good coffee. And so it's been a mix over time, but yeah, I definitely have some kind of favorites, but I don't want to play favorites right now. So
Yeah, it's interesting. You're reminding me of a couple places, when we were first talking about opening Diesel, we worked at Harold's Ice Cream, and that was probably one of the first like queer spaces, even if the owner was not, an ally per se. Everyone who worked there was queer identifying, and so we became this sort of like queer worker space. And I think we, created a place for people to come. And then also, I just wanted to recall that I worked briefly at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe. And that's very much a queer space as well, because of the people who are working there and doing their research there.
And there's so many amazing materials there about Boston's queer history too. I love the Schlesinger.
Yeah.
If folks ever want to check it out, I highly encourage you to do so, because there's so much great stuff there.
So this is an interesting one. This person says, I've been in spaces lately thinking about how food is used to symbolize liberation in many religious and cultural rituals. Do you see a similar symbolic nature of queer food?
So there's, in some of the queer cookbooks that I've looked at, people will talk about for themselves as like a personal symbol of liberation of a certain food, because maybe they ate it on a first date with like a lover, or that it reminds them of an important memory in time. Or there's also discussions of the kinds of foods that people ate while they were wasting from complications of HIV/AIDS. And there's a story of one person who cooked brownies with pot in it to help people suffering from the effects of HIV/AIDS, and distributed them around San Francisco, and people called her a saint. So in terms of that kind of like religious connection I would see those brownies as a kind of queer food and form of community care.
Really interesting. When we were writing copy for promoting this event, we used the word nurturing and feeding and these concepts, and that was what I was thinking a lot while reading your book and preparing for this, was this thought that a lot of queer people and more the further back you go in history, did not have supportive family. They were not being nurtured by their families, and these queer food spaces nurture them, feed them, fuel them. That's what that makes me think of. One last question is for Jennifer, and that's what's your favorite item on the Diesel menu?
You know, as I think about food, I think it is our constant pursuit to make, like, we make everything from scratch. So I can't think of anything that we just like open a bag and pour it into a container. So all of our sauces, our bagels are naturally leavened and hand shaped. Our croissants are also all shaped individually by hand. So I don't know if I can say that there's one thing, but I am really, really proud of the bagels we serve and all of our laminated products that we serve, because so much work goes into making them. And days of sitting in our coolers. So, you know, those products sit and have to kind of grow for 3 whole days before they can be boiled and baked off. So all the time that they spend, and I think, you know, hopefully that people feel that, and that's a huge part of why I love what I do, which is, you know, it is that concept of nurturing someone, and like you are allowing yourself to have something that's like very delicious food, and hopefully that you've had a really great experience with it and made a connection with someone who is serving that item to you. So yeah, and I think, you know, to me, the experience is just as important as the food. Hoping that there's been a positive connection with the person who's working there and the person who came in as a guest. It's really important to us as well.
You put so much thought and love into what you do, Jennifer. Thank you for being here. Alex, thank you so much also for your fantastic work, your beautiful book. This has been a wonderful conversation. I have really enjoyed it. Emily, thanks to you and everybody at QT Library for collaborating on this event with BIPAN Library. Here's to many more.
Here's to many more.
We would love to hear from you after this event, what you thought. Get in contact on either bipanlibrary.com or I believe it's qtlibrary.org, Emily?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Alex and Jennifer, could you share where folks can find you online?
So I actually don't have any social media.
I support it.
The best way to reach me is just through our websites, either through Diesel Cafe, Forge Baking Company, or Block Cafe. Like I said, I get all of those emails and I do look at them. So that's a great way to reach me directly.
You can go to my personal website, alexketchum.ca. I am located in Canada. I also have a Twitter presence, though that's maybe not as useful anymore. aketchum22. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Alex Ketchum. And I mean, if you Google me, I'm pretty easy to find. So yeah, but my website has my contact information. So, and links to open access versions of a lot of my work.
All right.
Thanks so much for having us. This has been
Thank
really
you.
great.
Thank you for coordinating.
Yeah, this has been wonderful. Thank you for your time. And I hope everybody in the audience has a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.